Good evening, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with you on this 1st of April. Of course, we know this as April Fool's Day, so here I am, ready to serve you in any way I can. I will give you my honest opinion on the weather and guide you through as we always do, and I promise no jokes, but this is always a suspicious day in just about any part of the United States of America. So there you are. With that disclaimer, 1-800-472-0391 is how to find your weather forecast any day of the year. Weather.gov/Alaska, of course, online, and that's my email. It hasn't changed, david.snyder@noaa.gov. When you have questions, concerns, or comments, whether about this show or any service in the National Weather Service around Alaska, I'm happy to help any way I possibly can, so please do use that address. Let's take a look around Alaska. It's a pretty quiet day as far as watches, warnings, and advisories go. So we're going to start in the south and take a look at AKwx, at the airport there. I don't see too many homes and businesses in the area from this vantage point, of course, but at the airport it is a blistering 68 degrees for April 1st. So pretty warm stuff there, and a beautiful bluebird sky. Pretty nice weather, and it looks like chances are things are going to stay fairly mild, at least for the next couple of days in AKwx. But colder air is on the way and a change in the northern parts of southeast. We'll see that in just a minute. Let's go out toward AKwx and southwestern Alaska in Bristol Bay, 48 degrees, 20 degrees cooler, a few more clouds there, and you're looking out over the runway and into the village. It looks like a generally beautiful day. The temperature is not nearly as warm as what we're seeing in south central and southeast, but still mild, 48 degrees there around the Bristol Bay coast. 28 degrees up in Shishmaref, though, and considerably cooler weather with the north wind coming in, it looks like. Plenty of cloud cover and still plenty of snow on the ground. It doesn't look like we're going to see a substantial warm-up into the 40s and 60s like we saw in our previous communities there, but certainly a fairly mild day, mild season for sure, around Shishmaref as we go. Let's take a look at the rest of the impacts around Alaska. It is breakup season, though, as many of you already know. A lot of changes are happening many weeks earlier than what we've been looking at in previous years. So right now, we're seeing changes about anywhere from 1 to about 3 weeks ahead of schedule. And if you're watching from the Tanana and Nenana area, we've been noticing that there is at least some open and mostly open conditions there across the central interior. So certainly a lot of changes going on there. And the upper Yukon is still getting some fairly decent ice reports. But areas around Nikolai, it sounds like the ice has gone out at Nikolai. In areas around southwest, the ice is fairly low concentration, if at all, in place there around southwestern parts of the Kuskokwim. So watch for changes, and changes may happen very quickly. In the coming week or so, we'll probably have an update from the Alaska Pacific River Forecast Center about the forecast for the rest of the season. Chances are you probably know some of that already just from your own experience and watching your part of the river, and some of that changing very quickly, if not early. As you would expect, too, with the very dry and warm conditions we've seen, fire danger is probably on many communities' minds. And at this point, we are not seeing any significant fire danger in the region. However, we are starting to monitor the forecast enough that areas in the central and eastern interior are now starting to produce fire weather forecasts, meaning conditions are changing toward that point. So we're certainly taking a closer look at that every day. It is now fire season in the central and eastern interior. Let's take a look at temperatures quickly. Here's southeast. We were talking about AKwx. There's AKwx at 68 degrees this afternoon. You can see many parts of the Panhandle are in the 40s, 50s, even 60s there around Sitka, up around Elfin Cove. 63 degrees as you get up toward Haines, Skagway, 61 at Yakutat. It has been a very mild day. Temps in the upper 50s around the capital city. Here's a look at the satellite picture, and you can see what's going on. Just plenty of clear skies across southeast. The satellite picture picking up a little bit of cold air here earlier this Monday. A wave of low pressure moving in from the western bearing, trying to create more clouds, but mainly this is the surge trying to lift northward, and a ridge of high pressure is extended across the south central, southwest, and the northwestern parts of the state. Here's a visible satellite picture, a little bit of a better story. You can see the intense clearing here across the eastern sections of the Gulf, and plenty of sunshine reaching into southeast. Everything that you see here in white is snow cover, of course, and melting quickly. And look at all the snow that we've lost across the interior. A lot of melt there, but not the case up north. Plenty of white up across the north slope. And if you look carefully, you can see some lines right here that have been moving southward. That's the next push of colder and wet air moving over the ice, heading toward the north slope. North winds already developed this afternoon, and visibility should start coming down as we go through the rest of the afternoon and into the evening. You can see a little bit of that fog dropping southward there. Weak boundary sitting right across the Brooks Range summits there. Low pressure's not that low out around Kotzebue Sound, and high pressure's not that high across the Yukon. However, it's all going to work together to allow that colder air to slowly drop southward as we go through the mid part of the week. The trouble is high pressure is anchored pretty well across Southwest and the Gulf of Alaska, so it's really going to slow that progress and really chew away at the impact of that colder air, but it is coming. Looks like areas of light rain popped up across parts of Southwest. Nothing too significant there. We saw a little bit of light rainfall around the southern tip of the Alaska Peninsula out toward Dutch Harbor and on Alaska. Keep your eye on the low out in the west. You can barely see it on the screen, but it is advancing. And we actually have two waves. One of these is really going to fall apart fairly quickly, but it does have some milder air behind it. That's going to help create some rain between that and the next disturbance that should stay south of the Aleutians tonight. It's strong enough to create some gales in the region, but after weeks of storm force and even hurricane force winds out in the west, this is really nothing to write home about at all. It will be a little choppy out there, sure, on the water, but not as strong and as swift as what we've seen in recent weeks. Here's the colder air. The leading edge of cold air is indicated by this blue line with the pointy arrows telling us it's moving this way, and in that case it is dropping southward. Ahead of that, probably looking at some fog because high pressure is going to stabilize all of the air here and probably trap some of that lower level humidity down close to the surface as we cool things off pretty quick tonight. Again, most of the area, south central, southeast, still looking at a generally clear sky. North of that disturbance, fog with that north wind setting in will probably be the rule. As we get into Tuesday, really not a huge change here. The front drops southward. May see some light rain and snow develop in the region in the central and eastern interior. Conditions will probably stay generally dry around the Fairbanks region, but especially when you get up into the hills, that'll change fairly quickly. Watch for clouds to spread eastward. High pressure sits over the Gulf. Things stay nice, dry, and sunny for southeast. And out in the west, no big change. Gales are still possible along the chain. A trough of low pressure getting closer to the Pribilof. St. Paul and St. George may see some light rainfall there, and a steady southeasterly flow will be the rule, and generally quiet conditions for west and southwest and south central. For Wednesday afternoon, here's that front again, slowly working its way southward. Now it's reached the Alaska Range, and that's probably where it will stop for most people. Across northern parts of southeast, though, the front is getting closer to the highways, and it looks like there may be some precipitation there along the road system, but the question is how far south does that go? Does it make it to the capital city? We'll see. Right now, high pressure sits off the Arctic coast, and with that, fog may linger across the Beaufort Sea coast, and you'll notice the low out in the west is becoming pretty diffuse there and really made no major impact to the west coast. Here's a look at temperatures as we get into tomorrow morning. 30s to about 40 degrees in southeast, south central, lower to mid 30s there. 34 in Kodiak, the middle Tanana Valley, and Fairbanks itself at or just below the freezing point. Up north, temps go below zero, 5 to 10 below for the North Slope. Kotzebue Sound 20s, about 27 around Nome, and just shy of freezing for many in southwest, especially the Yukon Delta. Bristol Bay temperatures in the lower 30s. High temps for your daytime tomorrow, 50s to about 60 degrees in southeast. Juneau nearing 53, Yakutat 52, Cordova lower 50s for you, Homer and Seward in the 40s, closer to 50 in Talkeetna, about 40 degrees in Fairbanks. The North Slope, Utqiagvik looking at 3 above, Prudhoe Bay and Deadhorse not too far behind.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
And on to aviation now. IFR will be fairly widespread from Norton Sound to St. Lawrence Island all the way through the Bering Sea and the central western chain and the eastern chain up into the Alaska Peninsula, generally on the south side of the Pacific coast, with marginal conditions extending up toward Chillicothe Strait and Kodiak Island. Most of the Gulf should be VFR, including southeast and the southern coast of south central. Look for a very slim region of marginal, generally in the upper Yukon Valley east of Bettles, with IFR inside of Kotzebue Sound and north of the Arctic coast. That drops southward with northerly winds moving in, and because of that, you'll also see marginal levels developing on the north slopes of the Alaska Range here and westward into the middle Yukon Valley from about Eagle southward through Northway as well, maybe even a little bit further south than that. Southeast still looking pretty good, as well as Prince William Sound, Cook Inlet, all the way to Kodiak Island, where we start to see marginal levels develop, and then widespread IFR here also snaking its way into the northern parts of the Yukon Delta region and hit and miss inside of the Bering Strait with some daytime improvement around St. Lawrence Island. That drops again as we get into Wednesday morning with IFR for St. Paul and St. George, and then again across the Pacific coastline of the Alaska Peninsula. Marginal levels surrounding a large part of Kodiak Island. IFR across the eastern slopes of the north slopes of the eastern Alaska Range with hit and miss marginal levels around Some of the higher terrain in south central, mainly Dehne Pass, would be the main concern. Southeast looking pretty good, but you'll notice some changes across the outer coast that's starting to push southward toward the Dixon entrance Wednesday afternoon. Things look pretty good for south central, Prince William Sound, southwest, the interior, and the north slope. But watch for IFR here changing around St. Paul, St. George, and St. Matthew, as well as the Pacific coast of the Alaska Peninsula, with some improvement across the central chain for Wednesday afternoon. Anaktuvuk and Adigan Pass look pretty good. VFR through looks like Tuesday afternoon. Lake Clark and Merrill Pass still looking pretty good there. As you go around the Horn, though, Rainy Pass, VFR probably dropping to MVFR by the afternoon. Look for similar conditions around Windy Pass and Isabel Pass, also expecting to go down just a little bit into marginal territory as your Tuesday afternoon goes on. Mentasta Pass again. The north slopes will be the primary concern as that colder air is starting to move southward once again. Dehne Pass looks to be okay for the moment. You'll see some changes on Wednesday. Portage Pass, visual flight rule there, and Chilkoot and White Pass look pretty good. VFR throughout your Tuesday. Freezing levels still show a lot of warmth across southeast and the Alcan border here. You'll notice some changes across southwest and especially across the northern interior as we go through your Tuesday morning. Notice a surface freezing line right here across the Yukon Delta north of St. Matthew, and then all the way across the Gulf Coast, and then starting to drop southward just a little bit across northern parts of southeast. Icing potential is limited mainly across the interior to areas above 6,000 feet and kind of a thin band from just inside of Kotzebue Sound and just south of the Yukon Valley. South central still pretty dry. As you get out to the west, levels are still fairly high, between about 9 and 10,000 feet to get into that isolated moderate range there, but this is trying to move itself north and east as new fronts are working their way into the Bering. You'll see that again a little bit later. Right now, the jet stream has fast-moving air generally across the northern parts of the Gulf. That's only about 50 to 65 knots, but you can get the sense of that northerly push returning to the interior of Alaska. Out west, you get that surge from the south and east, so this is trying to work its way north and east. The overall pattern still under the influence of a pretty large and effective ridge across the west coast of Alaska. And the main corridor of Pacific weather is moving just to the south of Alaska at about 150 to 160 knots south and west of the state. Now, right now, some changes there coming in on that northerly flow. You can see that at 9,000 feet. Northerly is working its way into the Arctic coast, about 15 to 20 knots. High pressure still in charge of the eastern Gulf with a south and easterly flow coming to places like Kodiak Island, southwest and south central. And then the broad southeasterly feed still continues across the central and eastern chain and most of the Bering, anywhere from 20 knots at its weakest to about 50 to 60 knots out west. At 3,000 feet, that pattern's still here. You can see the trough of low pressure trying to lift north and east a little bit. That's going to increase the flow across southwestern Alaska. Interior winds starting to build in a little bit more from east to west. And the north slope wind still about 10 to 15 knots. Low pressure here across the Yukon driving in a little bit of a northerly push, but high pressure still in charge here across the Gulf of Alaska between 15 and 20 knots. So turbulence, once again, the same old places are still going to have some thumps and bumps. Watch for some changes here across the northwest coast. Generally isolated moderate there from about Point Lay, maybe even around Wainwright, southwest of Point Hope. Again, below about 4,000 feet. More widespread across the Alaska Peninsula, Sandpoint west all the way out toward Attu, St. Paul, St. George, St. Michael, or St. Matthew, and Nunivak Island below about 4,000 feet with considerable moderate, mainly over the chain. Welcome back to another edition of Alaska Weather Facts. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider. As you well know, you can get forecast information for any day of the week. Today, tonight, tomorrow, out to 6 or 7 days. It includes the high and low temperature, the wind direction, the chance of rain or snow in your part of Alaska. But did you know that there is information available to forecast out to 2 weeks? So the question is, how would you use that information? And here to answer that question today and tell us a lot more about climate services from the U.S. National Weather Service Alaska region is Rick Thoman. He's the program manager for the Climate Science and Services. And Rick, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Dave.
How would we use information that is out to 2 weeks instead of just the high and low and the chance of rain?
Well, Dave, as we move out in time, of course, forecasts become more uncertain. So as we move into that second week from now, we're not looking at specific highs or lows or precipitation amounts at any given place. What we can do with the state of the science at this point is get a handle on patterns. So we can say things like increased chances for stormy weather in the Bering Sea in 2 weeks, or we've been in a cold weather pattern. Looks like 8 to 10 days from now, that pattern's going to change. Those are the kind of forecasts that we can currently make in that second week.
So you're increasing lead time for perhaps big or small weather events and telling us the likelihood of maybe more coastal storms or wind events in some areas?
Those are the kinds of things that that we hope to be able to let Alaskans know in the second week forecast. And if you have an activity or an event that you would find that kind of advance notice useful, whether it's moving stuff off of the beach, whether to go out hunting or to come back from camp, those kind of decisions, the week 2 provides the opportunity for you to get a handle on that kind of information.
Okay. What other type of weather impacts that we're familiar with might Alaskans use climate services for?
Well, in the forecast realm, we can go provide some information from this week 2, say the 8 to 14 day period, on out to the monthly and even seasonal time scale. Now, those monthly seasonal forecasts are still kind of just really very much pattern dependent, and the amount of detail that we can provide at this point is still pretty limited. Generally, indications of how temperature and precipitation will fall in maybe above normal, below normal kind of range. But in the week 2 period, we can be considerably more specific than that as far as the general patterns and really the impacts on Alaskans.
Okay, so we would be talking about generalizations there that would tell us that the period might be more stormy, might be more hot, more dry, more cold, and situations like that.
That's correct. So we're not going to be able to say in which community, for instance, there's the threat of coastal flooding, but we can often be able to tell we're moving into a pattern that would be conducive to big Bering Sea storms. So if you're in an area that could potentially impact you, you'll want to pay attention to the weather forecast.
Okay. Now, every day and every hour of the day, the National Weather Service is working on a forecast for the next day. But how do you start your forecast process for that extended period that goes out beyond 7 days?
Well, the way things work right now, we start off with the expected general flow pattern for Alaska and the whole world, really, and then we narrow that down to Alaska. So we start off with the basic computer model forecast. There's quite a few different computer models that we look at, bring those together. And then another important part of that is we attempt to assess the confidence. The reality is often 2 weeks away, the computer models are very divergent. They have lots of different solutions, and that's an indication that we don't have much confidence. But when we see more agreement in that time frame, and when that agreement is a pattern that will be potentially very impactful for Alaska or is a big change from what we've been in, that's when we can then take that expected pattern. We have computer models forecasting it. We've assessed the confidence. Now we can move that forward. How, using our experience as Alaskan weather forecasters, how does that typically play out for Alaska? So is this a stormy pattern for the Bering Sea? Is this an extra rainy period for Southeast? Is this the kind of pattern that generates strong winds potentially in the Anchorage Bowl? Is this a deep cold pattern for the interior? All of those are the kind of things that we're looking at in these large-scale patterns. That's very different than telling you that the winds on 10 days from now are going to be gusting to 120 on the hillside. We're looking for patterns, not the very specific information that the Weather Service will then hone in on as the event gets closer.
So the idea is to keep the 5, 6, 7 day forecast the same, where you are getting the standard high and low temperature and the chance of wind or rain, but further out you get a broad general forecast, but as the time gets closer to that event, we'll get a lot more specific.
That's correct.
Okay, very good. So how can people use this information if I am out in the bush and I want to see, is a coastal storm expected in my region, or is a chance for that improving over the next 2 to 3 weeks? Where could I go to get information like that?
When we see that potentially impactful or a big change in the weather is coming 8 to 14 days out, typically we will start to highlight that on the Weather Service Facebook site. We might produce a YouTube video highlighting that, linking that on our Facebook site. So often we don't, at this point, we don't have much to say in that because we're really looking for those forecasts of opportunities. But one thing we can say very likely as we go through the next 2 or 3 years, there'll be more and more of this kind of forecast information available in that week 2 time frame.
Okay, and something that emergency managers and city planners and folks in villages might be interested in keeping an eye out for, looking for that information to be headlined, whether that's on social media or perhaps through the National Weather Service channels there to get information from you to make better plans a little bit longer term and make better preparations in the event that things become a little bit more unsettled.
Absolutely. Climate Services with the National Weather Service Alaska region is talking to the state of Alaska every week, apprising them of that 2-week outlook. And on the social media side, we are working to keep Alaskans informed so that when we think we have some confidence in a high impact or a big change, that's the best way right now for folks to find out about that. Twitter, Facebook, so stay tuned to your National Weather Service.
Very good, a developing program. Rick Thoman with the National Weather Service Alaska region. He's a Climate Science and Services Program Manager. Thanks so much for joining us again, Rick, and I hope to have you back again soon.
Great, thanks Dave.
For another edition of Alaska Weather Facts, I'm meteorologist Dave Snider. We'll see you next time.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
And onto your sea ice update now. You'll notice the areas in blue, which are marginal ice, continue to linger around St. Lawrence Island and just south of the Bering Strait, but we also see substantial areas of marginal ice or low concentrations of ice there across the Kotzebue Sound region and up the Chukchi coast toward Wainwright. What we expect to see in the next couple days is more of a north and easterly push, so a lot of the loose ice or pack ice that's kind of free at the moment is probably going to start moving a little bit more toward the west in the coming days, so don't be surprised to see some changes where you are, especially in Norton Sound and south of the Bering Strait. For the very latest imagery and updates, you can get more information at weather.gov/Anchorage/ice. On to the weather in southeast now. Conditions remain warm and winds remain fairly light there with high pressure in control. Light south winds there in the Lynn Canal. We're going to start to watch for some changes though as we head into the midweek with a little push of northerly winds coming in. Look for light winds and small seas in Stevens Passage and down through Clarence Strait. Across the outer coast, a little bit more of a north and westerly flow coming down about 10 to 15 knots, so still no big deal. About 4 to 5 foot seas should be expected there. Winds remain light, seas remain small for Wednesday. A little bit more of an onshore push into Cross Sound around Gustavus and all the way up to Yakutat. That's going to keep things fairly warm for most places. And there's that northerly wind I was talking about. Lynn Canal, 25 knots, 5 foot seas. Elsewhere in south, those light southeast winds will continue to rule the weather picture, about 10 to 15 knots and 2 to 3 foot seas there for midweek. Light winds, small seas across south central, Cook Inlet through Prince William Sound there, 10 knots, 10 to 15 or so outside of Prince William Sound, and about 3 to 4 foot seas across the north and western Gulf. Look for a little more wind around Cook Inlet as we get into your Wednesday. Winds come up from the north, 20 to 25 there, especially south and west of Homer into the western Barrens. Look for 4 to 5 foot seas there, 3 foot seas inside of Prince William Sound there on Wednesday. In the west, in Bristol Bay, a little bit more of a stronger easterly flow, 25 to 35 knots down the Alaska Peninsula's Bering Sea coast, 5 to 9 foot seas there, 5 foot seas in fact inside of Bristol Bay. Light winds inside of Shelikof Strait, and as you head down past Sand Point, the seas and the winds start to come up sharply, 25 to 40 knots there of a change coming down the coast. Watch for gales, especially out toward the west. As you get into Wednesday, the seas and waves come down, or seas and winds come down a little bit more. You're still looking at a light north and easterly flow around Kodiak Island, and winds are still up a little bit higher around the Alaska Peninsula, but you won't see that sharp increase as you head past Sand Point toward False Pass and Cold Bay. Out toward the chain now, 35 to 40 knots. There's some of those higher winds and seas as we were looking at around Nikolsky and Unalaska Dutch Harbor. Anywhere from 35 to 40 with sustained winds blowing in from the east and seas holding around 18 to 20 feet. Out in the west, not a big change, 25 to 35 knots. They're still blowing in from the east with 18-foot seas on Tuesday, and then a change to more of a southerly flow developing in the west, 15 to 17-foot seas expected Wednesday, 25 to 30 knots there from Kiska to Attu, and a south and southwesterly flow coming in over the central and eastern chain. Seas and winds come down just a little bit there, 17 to 19-foot seas expected midweek. out along the west coast and up toward the ice pack now, 25 to 35 knots, anywhere from the north and the east. You'll notice the higher winds and seas closer to St. Paul, St. George, and St. Matthew there, about 40 knots or so with a 15-foot sea, 16-foot seas around the Pribilofs. As we get into Wednesday, that easterly flow continues, but the higher seas and the highest winds move out toward the west a little bit, away from the coast. So we're still talking about 25 knots for most areas inside of Norton Sound, all the way down toward the Pribilofs with a 7 to 9-foot sea. For the North Slope, north and easterly winds now develop over the Beaufort Seacoast, and we're still talking about ice there. And with that air coming in from the north and over that cold ice there, we're expecting to see areas of fog developing across the region Tuesday and into Wednesday. No substantial wind there, so we're not looking at any wind warnings or any major rounds of precipitation at this point. An offshore flow blowing from Wainwright to Cape Lisburne and Point Hope, 20 to 25 over the ice. Northeasterlies in Kotzebue Sound. And over the Bering Strait, expect 25 knots with a 4-foot sea in the open water. It looks to be a little bit more of an easterly flow on Wednesday. Seas come up to 5 feet. A little bit of a stronger offshore wind for the Chukchi coast, and we're still looking at northeasterly winds from Prudhoe Bay and Dead Horse out toward Utqiagvik. A little bit more of a northwesterly flow is expected around Kaktovik as we get into Wednesday afternoon. Here's a quick recap of your weather tonight. Colder air is trying to advance southward toward the Brooks Range. It should make it. You'll see more clouds and maybe a little more snow across the higher terrain, but below that it looks pretty dry. You'll probably see some valley fog, and that's about it. Watch for clouds to push southward toward the Alaska Range as we get into the overnight hours. Southeast still looking dry, high pressure still in charge of the Gulf, and several waves of weather will be working through the Bering Sea. It looks like the first one's going to gradually fall apart as we get into tonight and tomorrow. The next wave will keep some of the weather active across the chain with the main focus well in the west. Colder air makes its way to the Alaska Range and northern parts of Southeast by Tuesday.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.